Monsieur Nigel Leigh est professeur de neurologie au Brighton Sussex Medical School au Royaume-Uni. Il va donc vous faire part un peu des avancées au niveau mondial de la recherche dans le domaine de la sclérose latérale amyotrophique.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Madame Casalin-Fouquin, messieurs, mesdames, chers collègues. Je vous remercie que cet honneur, cette opportunité. Je regrette que je ne peux pas parler pour toute cette lecture en français, mais peut-être c'est mieux. Eh bien, so yes, thanks. My original title was Le défi mondial de la SLA. So I'm sticking to that. It's a big challenge for me, but a much bigger challenge for people with ALS, SLA. Forgive me if I call it ALS. I may talk about MND, motor neuron disease. I'm using the terms interchangeably, so don't read anything into that. I was doing some back-of-the-envelope calculations about the number of patients, people with ALS in the world. Probably near 1 million, I would guess. If there are any mathematicians in the audience, they can correct me. If one looks at the sort of incidence and prevalence that we have in countries, mainly Western countries, where this has been studied. Now that, of course, won't apply exactly to all countries. Indeed, there are many countries in the world where we simply don't have any data on this. And there will be age patterns which militate against so many cases, because it is, as you know, a disease of aging, even though, as is evident before us here, it's not only older people who get ALS. So although it's not the most common disorder that mankind has to deal with, we all know about dementia, Alzheimer's disease. We all know from our experience, either at the sharp end, at the hard end, as people affected by this, or as physicians, researchers, and so on, how difficult a disease it is. So I'm taking Janus, the two-faced god, looking backwards and looking forwards to the future. But one thing I would say is that I'm going to focus on these areas more than on the basic science, because I know other speakers are going to be talking about this, and I cannot compete with the likes of Séverine Boilet and others when it comes to their expertise in that. Indeed, there's many areas I cannot compete with colleagues here. So I shall just tell a story that I think summarizes where we've come from over the last 25 years. Much of that advance with the support of ARSLA and in our own country, the Motor Neuron Disease Association, but that is based on the activities of many individuals working very hard, day and night, over and above their normal duties to make a change in this field, and that's what we're all trying to do. Now, I have to start with this gentleman, of course, Jean-Martin Charcot, who lived and worked not far away from here, as you know, because I think it is worthwhile looking back at the core concept of ALS as Vincent, myself, and others here would have been trained. Now, I speak for myself here because maybe English neurology was a little backward compared to French neurology, but the core concept I had was based on Charcot's very valid observations. He helped to show that this was a disease primarily of the upper and lower motor neurons. I have to be careful what I press here. Yeah, I think I can see here. So we have here the corticospinal tract neurons, a nice big one here, and then the spinal cord, the lateral corticospinal tracts, of course, and the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. And I guess it was really him and his colleagues who defined this entity. Initially, there was a debate about the relationship between the various phenotypes, that is, the clinical presentations of ALS, whether it was bulbar onset or limb onset and so on, as to whether they fell into one rubric. And we still have arguments about that. But most of the arguments amongst the aficionado, and we recognize Charcot's concept as the basic one. But, as I shall touch upon, we have had to radically rethink our ideas in many ways. This doesn't invalidate, of course, Charcot's contributions. But of course we all create mythologies, even in science, because we have to deal with data which we then have to interpret. So in interpretation there is always, there's a politics of interpretation, if you like. And so I was taught to believe that ALS was one disease. This was my teaching, and maybe it wasn't so backward here in Paris and elsewhere in France. This was the sort of concept, I guess, that did emerge over the almost 100 years, up to the late 1980s, perhaps. It was seen as a highly selective degeneration of corticospinal, brainstem, and spinal motor neurons, with a pretty uniform cellular, and I say molecular, but there was no molecular pathology to speak of if we're talking about pre-1988. We had shrinkage of cells, we had loss of cells, we had degeneration of tracts, but we didn't have a molecular marker when we looked at the brain. We had that with Alzheimer's disease, we had that with Parkinson's disease, to some extent. It was a rapidly evolving field at that time. We thought of it as a sporadic disease. This was not primarily a genetically determined disease. When I studied with Professor David Marsden, who was in movement disorders, he was the doyen of movement disorders. In Parkinson's disease, I remember him saying, not because he wasn't an intelligent and brilliant person, Parkinson's disease is not a genetic disorder. And the same sort of thing was being said about MND, how wrong we were. But it wasn't his fault, it was the whole climate of opinion. There's a beware here, climate of opinions can very often be wrong, so we have to always examine these. That's a little bit of preaching, I apologize. Cognitive abnormalities were thought to be extremely rare, although, of course, if you look into the literature, even as far back as Alzheimer himself, describing a case with muscular atrophy and psychosis and dementia, the literature was there. But generally speaking, it was not part of the rubric that patients had significant cognitive change. At least that's how I was taught. However, so the challenge then, so if we start in the middle, let's take 1988, no effective treatment then at all. Well, we can examine how much that has changed, but certainly the treatment was sometimes nihilistic. There were good doctors, of course, who cared for their patients, and we'll come on to that, but we could do very little, and there was, well, very little that was done. There were no ALS genes, and theories of causation, I cannot list them all now, but I suppose the key one then at that time was excitotoxicity, and that lives and thrives today, I'm glad to say. It is not dead, and it had important implications. What did we understand of natural history? We knew it was commoner in males, it was commoner with age and so on, but we didn't have any significant epidemiological clues, really. The basic facts and our knowledge of prognostic factors was fairly rudimentary. I've said we thought it was essentially a pure motor neuron disorder. That's a simplification, of course, but many of us took that view. First steps in molecular pathology in 1988, when a number of people described these little tangles, we called them skeins, being rather fanciful, skein-like inclusions, which were labeled by antibodies against the protein ubiquitin. We didn't at that stage have TDP43, which you may hear more about. But for the first time, there was we thought, uniform molecular pathology, which was the pathological hallmark of the disease. Like life itself, it turned out to be a little more complicated than that, but that was the essential story. That was the first step there. But when we come to clinical trials, and this was, they were just really starting then with TRH, a thyrotrophin-releasing hormone, the branched-chain amino acids, we had no truly validated clinical measures. So we were feeling our way, groping towards how to do clinical trials. And then finally, multidisciplinary team care it was really the exception, not the rule. The exceptions were honorable. One was Vincent, here at then Hôtel Dieu, I think Hôtel Dieu in Paris, where I came to see how it was done, and California with Forbes Norris. But these were the exceptions. I'm glad to say that practice, broadly speaking, has now spread and is really the standard of care, whatever manifestation it takes. It will differ from place to place. But at that stage, there wasn't any in the UK, I can tell you. So this is why I have to start here, not just because I want to flatter Vincent, because I really think it was a step change. It was a step change because it said, not only did it find that a drug, a small molecule, had some effect upon the progression of the disease, which was startling news for any neurodegenerative disease, but it laid the ground for a completely new appraisal of methodology, because here we were using survival. This is not an easy thing to do for obvious reasons. It takes time, it takes the understanding of the patients to understand why we want to use this rather alarming, it is an alarming endpoint, and why we might combine this with functional measures. And as you know, so just to explain this a little for people, if you take all the patients, supposing you were seeing all the patients together here and you were following them for 18 months, and you've got some on the riluzole and some half and half, say, on the riluzole and the placebo. This is all the patients taking 100 milligrams, which was the licensed dose. You can see there's a difference in survival. So the treated patients, that's the active treatment, do better. That's all we need to register. Not a lot better, but I think robustly, scientifically, a bit better. So did it change the life of patients radically? Probably not. But I do think it changed our understanding both of trials methodology and the potential for changing the nature of the disease and how we might detect that in a completely fundamental way, which one way or another has influenced everything we've done since. Well, I would argue that. And this is Vincent, and this is Gilbert Ben-Simon, who is our long-term collaborator, who was the clinical pharmacologist behind this. And many others here were involved.